Good afternoon, everybody. We are very excited here to kick off November with cybersecurity, even though the cybersecurity October month just ended. But I have two huge friends of mine, one that I've known for almost 15 years and another for a few years. And I think they are absolute experts when it comes to cybersecurity. I know we have a lot of our friends and clients here on the line. And this is just extremely important. It's the last thing I would ever want to have happen to one of my clients is be in a position to have to call one of these people, but they also are preventative as well. So I'm going to let them both introduce themselves. I'll let Greg introduce himself first and then Colin. So I'm going to hand it right over to you now, Greg.
Great. Hey, everybody. Thanks for attending. My name is Greg Hanna. I'm CEO at TOS Corporation, also known as TOS C3 in Massachusetts for the past 37 years, and am a cybersecurity expert in defending, preventing, recovering from, and helping with walking you through any problems you might have.
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Colin Zick. I'm a partner with the law firm Foley Hoag, where I co-chair our privacy and data security practice. I work with our clients on the whole range of privacy and data security issues, from developing policies, doing training, to, of course, incident response, dealing with the government thereafter, dealing with consumers thereafter if you've had a breach, insurance, all those aspects of the life cycle of privacy and data security.
Thank you, Colin. So I just want to start here with the first question, and either one of you can take it and then pass it to the other to answer as well. But what do you think are the top 3 things business can do to keep their company and clients safe?
I'll jump on that first real quick, and I'll pass it to Colin. Well, the first thing that you should do right off the bat, regardless, is do a quick assessment, do a security IT assessment of where you are today, get a baseline. From that, you're going to learn an awful lot about where you are with Active Directory, with Azure, with Microsoft 365, with all the technology that you have. That'll produce for you a giant list of remediation options that you can put a plan together for to have those straightened out. Once you've remediated those, now you're at baseline, and then now you would move on to the next step, which would be, monthly or quarterly continuous audits, making sure that you're patched, making sure that third-party programs are patched, that legacy applications are patched, a lot of older things, I mean by legacy, and that your operating systems are patched. So those kind of go together as number one. The next one is to make sure that you have an enterprise class endpoint detection and response system. If you can make it a managed detection and response, in other words, you have a third party who's watching you 24/7, looking for issues, looking for indications of compromise, looking for lateral movement, anything that can happen. Somebody clicks on the wrong email, they get a little phishing attack, especially as we get into the holidays with Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah and all the other holidays coming up. Hey, your UPS package is here. Oh, Amazon needs you to upgrade your credit card information. All of these things, 9 times out of 10, are just tricks to get you to click on them. And once that happens, it downloads, some nefarious software onto your system, malware. And with that malware, many things can happen depending on what it was. It can invite other people in. It can go lateral. It can hide out. They do a lot of reconnaissance in your system. They're grabbing usernames and passwords. And in your environment for a while, sometimes they attack themselves with ransomware later down the road, or they sell those credentials on the dark web to a third party as a kit for them to come attack you if that's what they want. So that's another critical area for you to do. And then the last one that I really recommend, you hear this word immutable a lot in our industry now. Basically means unchangeable or can't be touched or affected. So make sure that you put in an immutable backup system into your environment, whether you're SaaS only, like in the cloud, or if you're on-prem, hybrid, and in the cloud. Just real quick about SaaS, Microsoft, a lot of people use 365. They don't realize that Microsoft doesn't back up your tenant data. They basically make your tenant available to you and secure, but anything that happens within your tenant, meaning Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, all that stuff is on you as the customer of Microsoft tenant to back up and make sure it's safe and secure. Just because you're in 365 doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable to an attack. You are. And then if you have on-prem servers, you want to make sure that that backup system that's happening local is getting replicated offsite to an immutable cloud. In other words, a location that can't be changed, so that if something were to happen locally and they wipe out your data or delete your snapshots or something locally, you can easily step out to your cloud provider and have a clean ransomware-free download to restore your environment. And off to you, Colin.
So Greg went through a lot of things there, and they're all right. And they're a little bit more on the technical side of it. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the people side of things. And I think Greg would agree, your greatest vulnerability is actually people. It's generally not your systems. It's the people who are going to mess things up. And he gave some signs of how that can happen. So the first thing is you've got to train your people. You know, it's unfair to expect them just to know how to do things, or they may just do things the way they've always done them, which is probably wrong. So first of all, you want to train your people. As part of that training, you want to implement with your people multi-factor authentication on your systems. That's a fancy word, but it means basically there are two ways that protect your system going in. So you're going to type in a login and password, and maybe you're going to use your phone, and it's going to have some sort of confirmation. And you probably have this on your financial accounts, on other things that are sensitive. That should be the same for your business. You should have that multi-factor authentication. And the third thing you want to do, and then this is testing your people. It's a fancy word called penetration testing, but to simplify it and to get at those things that Greg talked about, especially at this time of year, you should be sending out to your teams fake emails. You can do it yourself. You can hire somebody to do it. You send them emails that look legitimate but aren't, and then you want to measure who responds. And that's part of your feedback loop to go back into your training and say, all right, are people recognizing what's in these dangerous emails? And are they clicking on the things they're not supposed to click on? Again, because it's the people who are going to screw this up. And it's getting harder and harder for regular people to identify when these things are happening. You know, I'm old enough to remember, and I think Greg's old enough to remember, the Nigerian prince emails. You know, oh, I'm the Nigerian prince and I've got this money and I'm going to send it to you. Or, you know, you've got some relative somewhere and they need money. So you're going to send them, you know, they ask the grandmother to send them money, those sort of things. They've gotten much more sophisticated with these sort of things. It used to be you could look and say, oh, I see some typos. That must be a bad thing. They've cleaned up the typos. They're now using artificial intelligence to generate phishing emails. So you could even have the voice of someone you recognize duplicated in a phone call to you that says, hey, send me money, or, you know, some sort of trusted person asking you to do things. You need to harden your people against these sort of things, and they need to get used to double checking, say, are we sure this is the right thing to do? Are we sure I should be wiring that money? Those sort of things don't cost a lot to do and can really yield big results.
Thank you both. So that yields the question, which you both kind of talked about. Do small companies need the same type of protection as larger companies?
Answer is 100% yes, especially, you know, as Colin mentioned, the human firewall, right? Because people exist in a one-person sole practitioner all the way up to, you know, IBM that with, you know, tens of thousands of employees, so, or hundreds of thousands. So the answer is yes on that. And it's just a matter of scale. I'll leave the legal and the human aspect to Colin, and I'll talk again a little bit about the technical aspect. So whether you're one user with one or two devices, or 10,000 devices, or somewhere in between, you know, there are still techniques that you need to implement, you know, that are physical, you know, and that are technical on your devices that will be, if you will, the last line of defense against a human firewall, right? So for instance, there's a technology service that we offer that's a managed detection and response service. And how it basically works is a sensor, if you will, goes onto any of your devices. And if someone by chance is in a rush during the holidays, even though they passed their phishing training and they were fantastic, but they were running out the door and they click on something. This system acts as a way to prevent the employee from attacking the company unintentionally and protects the company from the employee. So it'll actually identify, kill it, quarantine it, prevent it from becoming a problem. So yes, there are things that you should do, whether you're huge or small. And again, it's the immutable backup. It's the endpoint detection response, and it's the training. And I'll leave it there for Colin.
Right. I think you start out from the standpoint of, well, it can, especially if you're a smaller enterprise and you don't feel all that technically sophisticated, you feel a little intimidated by all this. But again, you start back with the things we talked about, those human things. Everybody can do those. Everybody can do those sort of things. And you don't have to hire, a big four consulting firm to do that. You can do a lot of that on your own. Then another thing that Greg talked about that's really important that will drive what it is you do is this risk assessment. And that sounds like a fancy term, but let's make it real practical, because that's what it is. It says, what data do you have and how is it protected and how does it need to be protected? There's some folks who don't have a lot of data. Now, everybody's got something, but if by and large you are a B2C, if you're B2C, you're going to have consumer data. If you're B2B, you don't. That's a big difference in terms of what the law is going to require. And so you need to think about those sort of things and say, well, what kind of data do I have? And the related question is, well, do I need it? And a lot of times we find people hang on to things that they don't need, and that just creates needless risk. These are things that everybody can do, big or small company. It's frankly easier to do if you're small, to figure out what have I got and do I need it and how is it going to be protected? There's just real basic questions that everybody should be asking themselves, and that you can do it on your own.
Great. I'll just add
Thank
one
you.
quick little wrapper on that. Based on what Colin said, is whether you're large or small, you should also just take heed of how much it would cost for an hour of downtime in your organization, right? Basically figuring out your costs, lost business, et cetera, multiply that out, and that'll help you come up with a reasonable budget for your particular situation. So cost of downtime, and then based upon that, you'll determine, the depth and how much you're willing to spend on ensuring against that not happening.
Yeah, I think that feels, I always use this, and it's because, again, I'm old, and I think people don't recognize this anymore, but there used to be a commercial for Fram oil filters back in the 70s. Greg knows this one, and you may have seen it when you were a child, Francesca, but there's a mechanic under the car, and the basic punchline is, you can change your oil in your oil filter regularly, or you're going to have an engine breakdown. And his line is, you can pay me now, or you can pay me later. You're going to have to pay for this one way or the other. And it's true in cybersecurity as well. You're going to have to spend resources. But to Greg's point, you spend a little bit of time and money now. You're going to save a whole bunch of time and money later, both in the opportunity cost of being shut down and in the expense of recovering and so forth. I mean, we've seen it, as a lawyer, I see it because I see it happen to, and I'll knock wood, other law firms. I know of large international law firms that were shut down for a week, couldn't touch their computers. Can you imagine the amount of money they lost at the outrageous prices that lawyers charge? It's crazy. And so you've got to think about that in relation to it and spend accordingly to, okay, what's my risk? And that goes something we'll talk about, probably a little bit later, is the cyber insurance. People may say, I'm too small, I don't need cyber insurance, I can't afford it. Wrong. It's tailored to different size people, and the process of getting it will help you be more compliant. You'll be in a better space.
Yes. So can you speak to any recent data breach cases and the organization's response to it, since we're talking about that?
I can do it, Greg. Do you want to do it? I can go either way.
Well, you have much more in-depth knowledge of that than I do. The subject matter that I would have would be what's in the public already, like MGM and other various insurance companies locally.
Well, this is a public. I can't talk about existing clients. This is a client. The largest health plan in Los Angeles, California, so a big health plan, just had to pay $1.3 million to settle security issues because it had a breach. And what happened, especially if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare, is that you have to report that breach. And now if we're dealing with consumer information, you're going to report it to the state AG. If you're in healthcare, you're going to report it to the feds. There's laws about all these things. So they had to pay $1.3 million. That's a lot of money. But probably worse is they had to sign an agreement that required them for 3 years to be monitored by the government. And I will tell you that if you have one of those agreements, it costs you $1 million a year to comply with that agreement. Wow. Because you're going to have a lawyer, you're going to have an auditor to come in and look at your systems, you're going to have to issue a report and deal with the government and make sure that they're satisfied. And if they're not satisfied, you get years tacked onto that agreement. So, real life thing. And it wasn't a major breach. It was a breach, but it wasn't really in like the millions and millions of individuals. But when you think about, just that kind of scope, and why did this happen to them? Because they didn't do a risk analysis. They didn't implement the right security measures. They didn't review their system activities. They didn't implement the right hardware and software. All the things that we've just talked about, the technical and the not technical, they didn't do, and it caught up to them. And and this is just from September, and I could give you a list, particularly in the healthcare space, and I spend a lot of time in that space because there's so many attacks in that space. I could get you a list of 30 different breaches that occurred around the country in the last month in healthcare, because it's rampant there. It's rampant in lots of other industries. And, but the pattern is the same over and over and over again. It's people who could have done more and didn't and wound up paying the price.
Mm.
So how does an organization know about one cyber insurance, and what do they do when that cyber liability insurance falls short of what it should?
I can start as I was talking about. Right, feel free to jump in. So
go ahead. Yeah.
The cyber insurance part is fairly easy. There are brokers all over the place who will help sell you cyber insurance, and the prices are quite reasonable. You can look at, if you have a small company, let's say less than 20 employees, you can be talking $5,000 a year. And when you think about what it could cost you from the business interruption, from the responses, from the compliance, that's not bad at all. So the key is, find a broker. Call somebody like me, call somebody like Greg. Who do you know who is a good broker, who has access to different companies that are selling policies that cover different size companies? These exist out there. It's way better than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago when the policies were all over the place. They're pretty good now, and the prices spiked, particularly at the height of the pandemic, because there was a lot of activity going on against companies, because the hackers decided to have a lot of fun. That changed, interestingly enough, once the Russia-Ukraine war started. The Russian hackers got busy hacking Ukraine and stopped hacking the US for a while. And so breaches went way down. They're back because I guess the Russians have figured out how to attack two different countries at the same time. But the insurance has taken the course of that time to come back down. The prices are pretty reasonable. At the very least, you owe it yourself to talk to people in the business and get a sense of what it's going to cost you.
Yeah. And let me just add a couple of things, since we're talking about cyber. I'm going to make the leap of faith that most or many of you listening today have it in your organization already, cyber liability insurance. But, there are a few things that you may want to check into or that you may not know about, which I have learned over the years from personal experience, as well as walking clients, through being hacked and taking them by the hand through remediations and so on. First of all is that cyber liability insurance, I don't know if all work this way, but at least cyber is a prepaid insurance. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you had a cyber breach and it was a ransomware attack and they wanted $500,000, let's say, for the ransom. And you get that negotiated down, and let's say that you have to pay $250,000. Well, what happens is that you, as the victim, if you will, has to come up with that $250,000, and then once you pass compliance with your insurance company, then they would reimburse you that 250,000. So that's the first thing that you have to understand. Second thing is coming up with $250,000 worth of cryptocurrency, maybe something that you've never been familiar working with, and buying it and trading with it and doing all of those things. That can be onerous, and it can be a little bit terrifying for some people. So there are places out there that deal with digital assets, who will actually put up the money for you, if you will. I don't want to call it hard money, but it is money that's available to you to help you through these situations, and they'll actually deal with putting the crypto out for you and taking care of that. So those are just a couple of things to be aware of. And then finally, I guess the last thing is just make sure that the coverage is adequate, as Colin was saying, based on what your needs are and what might happen if it's a case of potential liability because of errors and omissions on top of it that created the breach. Just make sure that you're covered adequately.
One
So we
additional
actually-
note, if I could just follow up on the insurance point and particularly the ransom payment point, and this is super important. Paying ransom, and Greg alluded to this because you need help on the crypto side, but you need lawyers involved in that too, and you probably need the FBI involved. And why is that? You say, well, because you could wind up creating a bigger mess. I talked about where some of these folks who issue the ransomware are from: Russia, China, North Korea. What do all those countries share? Iran too, throw them in there. They're on a list of bad guys that the federal government says you can't do business with. And if you do business with, you get in a lot of trouble. And so remember, that's where potentially your ransom is going. So you need to talk to the feds before you pay a ransom. And you need to get them to sign off. They are not very happy about people paying ransom, but they will sign off. If you point to a situation where you said, look, we are screwed and people are going to suffer if we don't pay this ransom, you can work with the feds on that, but and that means you need a lawyer. And I'm sorry to say it because it's self-promoting, but it's true. You just don't walk into the FBI and start talking to people. You need somebody who knows the people at the FBI, who knows the questions to be asking, so you're prepared, so they listen to you, and so they help you.
That's important. And just a quick follow-up to that, is the reason they're now people are paying more than usual is because they have double extortion and now triple extortion. And it used to just be that we lock down your environment, the ransomware shuts you down, and then you can restore from a backup. Well, they decided that as part of the ransomware attack, they'll actually exfiltrate or take your data so that if you can restore, they now hold the second part of it, the extortion piece over your head, saying, well, I have your data and your client's data, and if you don't pay us, even though you restored your environment, we're going to release it to the dark web. So that's bad. And then now the third thing they're doing is reputation damage. So, they will put your reputation of maybe personal or company up. And so those are the areas where they're holding people accountable now more. So.
Thank you. So we actually do have a question from one of the participants. Their information is on the dark web because of the Harvard Pilgrim breach. How can people in the same situation protect themselves since they can't control breaches at big companies that have their personal information?
Great. I'll throw that out real quick. And then first of all, a few things that like Colin already mentioned. So password hygiene, real important, right? Username and password hygiene. You should always be changing your password. You should also always be using some level of enterprise password management system. In other words, coming up with a simple English word, dictionary word type password, it just can't be done these days. You need something that's 12 characters, 20 characters, whatever, that's all messed and jumbled that you can never memorize. So that's why a password manager is important. Couple that with least privileged access. So making sure that, if you're a user, you shouldn't be an administrator, right? And the administrator who's doing backup shouldn't be an Active Directory administrator. So there should be different levels of privileges. So least privilege that you need to get your job done should be in there. And then everything should be handled with multi-factor authentication, as Colin said. It might be key fob, it might be push tokens, it might be, somebody calling you on the phone and you pressing 1 to accept. But there's so many ways for multi-factor to be in play now.
Right, and it doesn't have to be hard, but I think I'll really reinforce the notion of the password manager. There are a couple of different ones that I use. One's called 1Password, another one's called LastPass. Ironically, both of those have had breaches themselves, but it really is the most effective way to be able to use complex passwords without the problem of that we encounter a lot of times is if you make passwords more complex at your business, if you make people change them more often, you know what happens? They get a sticky note and they write it down and they put it on their screen or they put it under their keyboard. So you wind up actually being less secure by increasing the password technical requirements. And it's a paradox, but it's been studied and it's true. So how do you get the more complex password and get people to use it? With a password manager. Basically, you're putting all your eggs in that basket and you're really watching that basket. And you've got other people to watch the basket for you. If you do that, and I will say as comfort to this person, just because you were in the .32 breach doesn't mean you're the only ones with your data on the dark web. All of our data is on the dark web. It's just a question of how much and how new. And the whole idea is, yeah, are your old passwords on there? Sure. So you need new passwords. You got to stay one step ahead of the bad guys. Every time one of these things happens, okay, time to change passwords. You got the password manager. All of a sudden, they're changed everywhere you go. It's linked into your browser. And so if you use the same browser at home, at work, you log into that browser, you've got your passwords. You don't have to worry about writing them down anymore. I won't call out the particular relative of mine who has them written down on masking tape all over his office. He knows who he is, and we love him, but we really need to get him on a password manager.
Thank you, Colin. So this is an interesting one, but how can the company confirm that their cybersecurity or their IT company is doing a good job? You know, if they don't know cybersecurity or IT themselves.
That's a really great question. Well, first, let me just say this, that there is a lack of IT and cyber experts in the industry in general. There's way more need than there are people, which is why corporations and small companies and law firms and everyone are outsourcing to managed service providers and managed security service providers for that reason, to get the expertise. So it will go back to that assessment and to that audit and to that check. So just like going to the doctor to get your physical, every once in a while, you should have a third party do a checkup on your IT, on your compliance, and on your security. And basically, there's a series of tests that are performed. Some are automatic, some are manual, but all that information is then gathered. A plan is put together for remediation of issues and so on. Nobody's perfect. Companies miss things accidentally. Sometimes a patch isn't applied because the system wasn't on, so a third party comes in and does an audit, and it's like, oh wait, all these patches weren't done. Well, it was just missed once because, I don't know, there was a power outage or a building shut down that weekend or whatever that it was to happen. But that's probably the best way to get a checkup.
Yeah, and the good part about doing these kinds of audits is they will actually, in some circumstances, buy you credit in the event of a breach. If you can show that despite doing all these things, a bad thing happened, then frankly, the regulators will go easier on you. The example I gave about that LA health plan, they didn't do that, so the hammer came down. But if you could say, look, we did everything right, and still this bad thing, which nobody really could have anticipated happened, or, you know, somebody had a total lapse in judgment and did something, and we can't control the individual. They had been trained, they've been told not to do the thing they did, and they did it anyway. You can reduce some of the impact from the government, at least, on your company. And also, you're just going to be better off as you go on. It's like anything where you have, you know, in your the financial side of your business, would you go, if you're a significant size company, would you go without having accountants audit or review your books? No, of course you wouldn't, because you want them to be looked at and find things that aren't right. And it's the same sort of accountability that you want on the cyber side. It's just a little bit of different, you know, different techniques, but it's the same principle we're talking about.
Very good. So we're coming up here at 1:30. I do have one last question. How do security and privacy laws differ across industries? And are there any cases where companies have been held liable for the cyber attacks or breaches?
It's all you, Colin. They said law.
The laws, the laws are crazy different, and that's a real problem. In some areas we start out having one set of laws, like say healthcare. Everybody knows about HIPAA, right? You've heard about HIPAA, and not everybody understands how it works, but there's that one law. But when it comes to consumer information, what I like to say, the stuff that's in your wallet, your credit cards, your driver's license number, your social security card, there are different laws about those as you go across different states. And if you're a company that's doing business in multiple states, it's a real pain, frankly, to have to try to keep up with all of those. So that's a challenge of just cost of doing business. And what we see is a lot of companies will try to find ways to manage that so they comply generally with the laws, even though they're different in different places. And then if you wind up doing business overseas, if you're dealing with Europe, they got a whole other set of rules there called the GDPR, which is generally tougher than most of the US laws. And so that becomes the bottom line, the minimum that you have to comply with if you're dealing with that. Again, if you're in any of these contexts and you're dealing with individually identifiable information, these sort of account numbers, that sort of thing, you want to take some time and make sure that that's cared for. Because again, if you take those steps to do that, hopefully you avoid the breach. And if you do have a breach, hopefully the government goes easy on you.
Excellent. I'll open this up for questions, but while we're waiting, any last comments or advice you can give to a lot of our clients here on the line today? And I'll make sure that I send an email out with your contact information as well.
Great. I have just one thing I wanted to mention. You can do all of the audits in the world. You can do all of the training in the world. But there's something called a 0-day attack that you can't 100% prepare for, depending on which direction it's coming from. I'll give you an example. The most recent one that made national and probably global news was from Citrix Systems. They produce hardware and software to allow people to work remotely quickly and easily from any device. They have a firewall called the NetScaler. They had a 0-day vulnerability on that NetScaler to the degree that if it was exploited, it would give whoever exploited it administrative root access, the best, strongest, highest privileges that you could have, which would allow them basically to walk right through that firewall into somebody's data center. That was known in the wild, as they say, by the hackers sometime late May, early June. Citrix did not notify the world, the public, until roughly July 18th, and they didn't come up with a fix for it until July 19th. So think about that. So basically late May until mid-end July, you've got this empty window. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of these devices out there globally, and many of these breaches that we've been hearing and learning about over the past 3, 4, or 5 months have been due to this one 0-day vulnerability that there is really no protection against. There are techniques you can use now that are available now into the private sector that were more, military defense, secret squirrel type technology, such as zero trust network access and so on, that can actually cloak your data center. It can make you invisible, if you will, to hackers. And if they can't see you, then they can't get you.
Right. And I guess, but I say, 2 points. Don't give up. Don't think this is so hard that you can't do anything. It is a long journey, but as the Chinese proverb goes, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Do something. And then the other thing I say is, some of this is about not being the softest target. There's the other story about, the guys are in the woods and they see a bear, and the guy says, well, I'm going to run. And the guy says, well, you can't outrun the bear. And he says, no, but I can outrun you. And you don't want to be the softest target or the bear's going to get you. You don't have to be the fastest, but if you're not the worst, that has something. So do something. It doesn't have to be everything that we've talked about here today, but do something.
Well, thank you both so much for your time, and for everybody here on the line. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We will send along Greg and Colin's information, and we want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.